This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you for inviting me, and as you can see from my background, I'm not a soil scientist. I study atmospheric chemistry and climate, but for better or worse, sometimes one has to cross disciplinary boundaries and to see the problem solved. In other words, to look at ammonia emissions on a global scale in a comprehensive Earth system model. There was no soil scientist or biogeochemist or anyone that really wanted to address this problem on global scales, and so here I am. Before I begin, I should acknowledge Stuart Riddick. So Stuart was a postdoc here. He later left for University of Cambridge. So he initially formulated much of this model, and he formulated its structure. And also Dan Ward, who's sitting in the audience today, he's done a lot of work since Stuart left, getting the model in shape and understanding how it behaves. Okay, so both Stuart and Dan did a lot of the actual work on this project. So before I begin, I thought I should list here my questions that I'm going to address in this research. So they're probably different than many of the talks you've heard in this seminar series, and I work on the global scale, and I'm interested in climate. So the large-scale questions is how do fertilizer, manure, ammonia emissions change the climate, and how will climate impact these emissions? How do these emissions modify the nitrogen cascade, and how do the emissions change global pollution and health? So again, I'm interested in the global scale, and most of the work I do is in model simulations. It's not in the laboratory. It's not experimental in that sense. So this is it's a picture of Paris, March 14th, 2014. And this pollution event was attributed to springtime fertilization. It was very hot at that time in Paris. It's about the springtime when people applied their fertilizer, and it pretty much shut down the city for a week. Cars could only drive on even or odd days. Public transportation was free. They decreased the driving speed limit. Trucks were routed around the city. So a lot of this has been blamed on fertilization and ammonia emissions. Okay, so after an introduction, I'm going to talk about the model. I'm going to talk about some of the nitty-gritty, give the results, and then conclusions. So for the background, as I'm sure many of you are aware, that the nitrogen input into the Earth system has increased dramatically in the 20th century, and it's increased really since Haber and Bosch invented the process for making ammonia fertilizer out of atmospheric nitrogen. Okay, and so one can see this increase, especially here, after about 1940. And this increase has been thought to contribute to the large population increase over the 20th century. And incidentally, as I read a little bit about Haber, Haber was also not only invented nitrogen, this process, but he also is known as the father of chemical warfare. He invented a lot of chemical weapons. So he's an interesting character with pluses for humanity and definitely some minuses. Okay, so what's going to happen in the future? And in the future, as a population increase, the feeling is that the demand for nitrogen is also going to increase. And so this shows a number of scenarios for nitrogen fertilizer consumption. So this ends at 2100. And these scenarios are driven by population growth, shown here in red, biofuels, shown in green, and then what decreasing the emissions is efficiency in agriculture, food equity is increasing them. So we don't quite know what's going to happen in the future, but And these are the type of scenarios that are used in climate models. This is how the climate models work to predict the future. Is there's likely going to be an increase in nitrogen fertilizer consumption. And if you look in what's input into most climate models, the ammonia emissions are like this, reflecting this increase in nitrogen, but this neglects the impact of climate on the emissions. So ammonia emissions are very sensitive to climate. If you add the impact of climate, then you might guess that the ammonia emissions increase by almost a factor of 2. So this impact of agriculture and the increase of nitrogen emissions is quite a bit different than what one expects from industry and cars. And here, almost all the scenarios expect the other component, or the main component of nitrogen input into the system to decrease. And this is because already industrial countries have decreased the amount of NOx emitted into the air for air pollution regions, and it's expected that other countries too, for example China, will also follow along suit and decrease their emissions of NOx into the atmosphere. So in the future, fertilizer is likely to increase, ammonia emissions due to fertilizer are likely to increase, and NOx emissions are likely to decrease. At least that's the current thinking. Okay. So this is a figure of the nitrogen cascade, and nitrogen is essentially put into the system, largely into the farms in terms of fertilizer. It's also manure here, and in terms of combustion, and this is mostly in terms of NOx. Okay, so the ammonia emissions from the farms are estimated to be about 40 teragrams per year. The ammonia is evaporated off from the farms, and then it's cascaded down in the nitrogen cascade, and it lands on forests, natural ecosystems, etc. as you go down. So to understand the nitrogen cascade, to be able to simulate it, you have to get these ammonia emissions correct from the farm. And one can see that they are of greater importance than the combustion emissions. And they're meant to increase in the future, whereas these are meant to decrease. So getting ammonia emissions correct is an important part of being able to simulate the future nitrogen cascade. What does nitrogen do to climate? So in this figure here, I show the radiative forcing of various species on the climate. So this is essentially, you put these species into the atmosphere and you look at the change in energy balance at the Earth's surface due to these species. And one can see that the change in the energy balance from pre-industrial to 2011 is estimated to be about 2.3 watts per meter squared on the Earth's surface, according to this diagram. Now, this is known as the radiative forcing. Where does nitrogen come into this? Nitrogen is a form of fertilizer, and it's estimated that because the nitrogen emissions have increased, that more CO2 has been uptaken by the atmosphere. And so this has changed radiative forcing by between 5 and 10%. And to emissions associated with fertilizer use, it's changed the radiative forcing by about 0.17. NOx emissions, through its atmospheric chemistry, decreases methane and increases ozone, associated changes in atmospheric forcing. And then the ammonia emissions itself, ammonia readily forms an aerosol in the atmosphere. Aerosols tend to be reflective, and this has acted to cool the Earth's surface. So the nitrogen emissions have a lot of climate effects, from warming to cooling. And probably one of the most important impacts is in the aerosols. Aerosols are particulates in the air that essentially cool the Earth. And if you look at various years, so this goes from 2000 to 2100. This is from simulation. And it's projected that by 2100, these yellow line here, which is ammonia nitrate emissions, ammonia nitrate aerosols will be the dominant aerosol species. So right now, the dominant species is sulfur. It's projected that sulfur will decrease as the air is cleaned up over China and other regions, and that ammonium nitrates will become the dominant aerosol type, which acts to cool the earth.
Peter,
yeah.
those ammonium nitrate aerosols are formed in the atmosphere from ammonia reacting with
Yes, with nitric acid. Yeah. Okay, so in the beginning of the talk was input of ammonia emissions into an Earth system model, and it could be that some of you are not really familiar with what we mean by an Earth system model. So here's kind of a timeline of how they're developed. So in 1896, about 1900, using hand calculations, Arrhenius predicted 5 to 6 degree warming for double CO2. And then it waited almost a century till general circulation models were able to include double CO2. And the difference between hand calculation and a general circulation model, a large model of the Earth and ocean, was they allowed feedback due to water vapor and clouds. Although generally these models got about the same result as Arrhenius got by hand. And then later on, okay, you can predict the climate of the 20th century until you allow for the cooling due to aerosol scattering. These were included in the late 1990s into these models. And then around the early 2000s, the carbon cycle was incorporated, because if you add CO2 to the atmosphere, it's taken up, about half of it's taken up by the ocean and the land. And so this allows, if you want to include a transient response, if you want to simulate the climate from now until 2100, you need to incorporate carbon cycle. And if you incorporate carbon cycle, you need nitrogen. But nitrogen emissions were generally not simulated, and ammonia emissions were generally not simulated in these models, which is where this study comes in. Okay, so now I'm going to start talking about the ammonia emission model in the middle of a Earth system model. Their system model is essentially it's a numerical model. It's formulated as a number of grid squares, like here. So they range in the horizontal and in the vertical. And each square here, each of these grid squares, we have a model, a parameterization that simulates ammonia emissions. Okay. So that's where. So this is how it fits into this large-scale model. And these are the questions, I remind you of the questions I want to address from the beginning, and these are global questions. How does ammonia emissions influence climate? So the idea is to take essentially a process level model, but extend it to global scales. And to do this, we have to simplify local details to enable global simulation. So we can't put all the details in this kind of model. Many of the details are not available globally. It's very hard to get details of crop type, soil type, etc., fertilizer date, etc., globally. And the highly complex regional models are not appropriate for global simulations, because the global simulations were simulating many things. They're simulating the ocean, the atmosphere, aerosols, etc. So we have to simplify the model. We want to base this type of model in physics and chemistry to the extent possible, because things are based on imperial parameterizations and won't be sensitive to changes in temperatures, changes in precipitation. So if we base it on basic physics and chemistry, then we think we can incorporate the changes due to precipitation and changes in temperature. Modeling is an iterative procedure. I think it's important to remember that. I've talked about modeling here at Cornell, and many times people ask, oh, it's too complicated. How can you simulate that? Forget it. Okay? And the thing to recognize is that, okay, if you don't simulate it, it's not going to be in there. So you can simulate it to 0th order, and you have some idea of how it's going, and you can improve it. Okay? So it's good to start somewhere. And so I'm interested in is examining the response of the emissions to forcing changes in climate, temperature, precipitation, and eventually changes in management processes. Okay, incidentally, if anyone has any questions, ask me as I go. Okay. I'd just like to contrast the model I'm going to present with a standard model. So to most ammonia emissions in global models are based on emission factors. So for example, you take the dairy cattle, you take the kilogram nitrogen per head per year, you multiply it by the ammonia loss, and you get a number, and that's what you stick as your emissions in the model. And traditionally, these have been split into one region, into two different regions, depending on whether the agricultural practices were relevant for developed countries or developing countries. So the standard type of models people have used to predict global nitrogen, global ammonia emissions have not included any temperature or dependence on temperature or rainfall. So what we do is we take a fertilizer amount or manure amount, and we know this fairly well. There have been some studies that published in nitrogen in fertilizer, nitrogen in manure globally. And we take this amount and we feed it into a model for fertilizer and manure. Okay. And then it can go three ways. The nitrogen in there can go to wash off if it rains. It can go into emissions, and the emissions depend on the meteorology. They depend on the wind speed and the temperature and the surface roughness. So they depend on the boundular turbulence and temperature. Or the nitrogen incorporated into fertilizer and manure can go into the land model, which is another part of this larger system model. And within the land model, the nitrogen is apportioned to vegetation, to soil organic matter. It goes up and it denitrifies. It can go into leaching, runoff. It can go into fires, etc. Okay, so this is a base model that's already incorporated, and we're adding this parameterization on top of it. Then we need another important thing in these large-scale models is to conserve carbon and nitrogen. So when you add fertilizer, this is new nitrogen created, so you don't have to worry about that. But for manure comes from nitrogen that's eaten from the plants. So you have cows eat plants, they excrete manure, and then you have to take the carbon and nitrogen out of the plants to make the manure. So these type of models is very important to conserve carbon and nitrogen because you want to look at how these how the budgets change. Okay, this is a cow for Stuart. Stuart is Scottish, so I think it's a Scottish cow. So what we've done, if we have a pool of ammonical nitrogen here, as I said, this can wash off, it can go to gas, or it can go into the land model to the nitrogen pools here. Fertilizer goes into this pool, as does manure. And manure is divided into three separate pools depending on how fast it's broken down by bacteria. Okay, and then again, there's this cycle from the land model back to the plants to conserve the carbon and nitrogen from the manure.
What's the
TAN, total ammonical nitrogen. Okay. So for fertilizer, it goes into a pool. So you add the fertilizer to this pool. This quickly decays. It depends on the temperature, how fast it decays. And it goes into TAN pool. For simplicity, we only apply the fertilizer towards the beginning of the growing season when planting conditions for corn are met. And this is determined from meteorology. So if it gets warmer in the spring, this fertilization application will occur warmer, or warm years will occur at different time than cold years. And throughout, we don't consider agricultural practices in the model. So agricultural management is going to have to be added on at a later stage. Okay, manure. So I said it goes into 3 different pools. This is a tan pool here. These pools, these available, resistant, unavailable, decay at different rates. They break down at different weight rates depending on temperature. So 1 day for this available pool, much longer for this resistant pool, and this unavailable pool essentially gets incorporated into the soils. We assume the manure is spread on the fields continually throughout the year. And again, this is a place where we decided not to consider agricultural practices, putting on the fields a few times or keeping the cattle in stockyards, etc. We just assumed it was spread continually onto the fields. Okay, and then the tan pool, what goes on in here? We essentially have an equation for the ammonia gas that's in equilibrium within a water solution within this pool. So the gas depends on the amount of N in this pool, and then there's some rate constants below it, depends on the pH and some Henry's law rate constants as given here. And it depends on the amount of water in the pool. So we have to predict the amount of water also in this tan pool. And the rate equations are such that the gas, the amount of gas emitted increases exponentially with temperature. So there's an exponential temperature increase here. As this warms, it becomes less soluble to ammonia, and there's more ammonia gas sitting right on the boundary of the pool. Okay. Oops. Let's do this. The emissions are essentially proportional to the amount of gas sitting on the boundary of the tan pool minus the amount in the atmosphere divided by some resistances. Okay, and then this, we take the wash off from the global news model, runoff from the tan pool. Okay, and then there's conversion from the tan pool to the soil pool, which we simply account for as diffusion, either of ammonium or nitrate, and they have different diffusion rates. Okay, so I think I talked about these assumptions. Let's go on to the results. So this is a distribution from Potter et al. 2010 of nitrogen from manure and nitrogen from fertilizer. And one can see for both manure and fertilizer, they are Europe, India, China, Midwest here are areas of heavy application. And then from manure, it brings in a number of other areas. Brazil here, sub-Saharan Africa, across this region here. Okay, so this is used as input to the model, and then we see what happens. And so we predict nitrogen emissions. This is a 10-year average in the model. This is from manure. This is from fertilizer. And again, for the nitrogen emissions, you can see these hot spots over India and China. You can see hot spots here over this part of Africa, India, etc. And this is because the emissions increase exponentially with temperature. So you warm the temperature, you get more fraction of the tan pool that evaporates as emissions.
Peter?
Yeah.
Are these emissions from the surface, or is this sort of net within a grid cell? You know what I mean?
These are from the surface, but the units are kilograms per year per hectare. Right? So they're surface emissions per unit area per year. Okay, so yeah, so what we do is we account for a canopy capture of the emissions. So so this is we're looking at the emissions from the land model. Once we connect it to the atmosphere, then we'll be able to simulate how much goes up and how much goes down. So you're right. There's a bidirectional flux of ammonia that's very hard to simulate. So here we assume some canopy capture from some numbers in the literature, but that is one of the assumptions that will be changed. Okay. So here, again, you can see in these over India, sub-Saharan Africa, where it's warm, a large percentage of the ammonia in the emissions are released as ammonia gas into the atmosphere.
Yeah, well, I can make a comment.
Yes.
As an agronomist, I would not agree with that picture of annual average emissions of ammonia.
Okay.
You know, because I mean, in India and Bangladesh, where you've got a big hotspot, people are not eating meat like that. They're mostly eating plant food. And the biggest emissions of ammonia are associated with animal-based agriculture,
Okay.
which is mostly in the West.
Okay.
And so, you know, as the United States, I mean, I think our main products, our main nitrogen products from agriculture in the United States is water, not food.
Yes.
Like 90% of it.
Right. Okay.
So it seems to me that I would have expected the U.S. to be much higher than Europe, and Holland in particular, we're all pigs, and India would be lower. So I'm curious about where that.
Okay. Well, I mean, there are two things in your question. One is the database. I mean, this is one of the best databases available. And what they did is to combine this, they counted animals in each country, and they took information from FAO, etc. And so this is the best, as far as I know, database for fertilizer and animals. Now, maybe it might not be correct. I don't know. But this is exactly one of the problems in trying to apply these things globally, is that we just don't have that good data. Okay? Okay, so evaluation. How do we do? I want to go over this pretty quickly, because here I'm showing some evaluations from previous versions of the model, though I expect it will be similar in this current version. And this shows manure emissions versus model versus measurement. R square is 0.84. The average amount percent evaporation changes from 5 to 90%, and one can tell this correlation between the model and measurements is largely driven by this change in temperature. When temperature is high, you get large emissions of ammonia, as might be expected. Correlation with fertilizer is not as good, but it's still significant. And here again, it's probably driven by temperature. We've looked at different emissions from fertilizer at different latitudes. Okay, I should say, as this has already been brought up, evaluating ammonia emissions are very difficult. The concentrations are not well characterized. Emissions are bidirectional. They can be up and down depending on the time of day. Ground-based measurements are challenging. They're highly dependent on meteorology, and the emissions are captured by the canopy and describe a rather complex resistance model. So I mean, when you make a model, you have to evaluate it, but evaluation here is challenging. So another way to evaluate a model is to compare it against other emission inventories. So in each of these diagrams is our emission inventory. This is the most recent one, which has come from a data inversion. It's another one which has developed within the last 4 years. And this is a sort of standard one used by global atmospheric modelers. These are split between manure and fertilization emissions. we can see that our emission inventory is about, all of them in fact, are about the same, emit about the same amount of nitrogen. Our split between ammonia emissions from fertilizer and manure is a little bit different than these two. We show more fertilizer, less manure. So it's between this one and this one by Edgar. So we write right between. I should say that all these inventories here, it's a great deal of uncertainty on these global numbers. If we can look at different regions, our US emissions, so this is us, and us. China, notice that the scale is to 12. US and Europe is to 4.5. So all of the emission inventories predict higher emissions in China than over the US and Europe. Our emissions over the US are higher than these other inventories, largely because we have larger fertilizer emissions. Same with and over Europe, where our manure emissions are a little bit lower than some of these others. But generally, considering what we're trying to do in this model, we're pretty pleased with these results. We're capturing the emissions within the range of the other emission inventories where there's a great deal of error also. Yeah? Yes, we do. Yeah. Yes, yeah. So we assume 50% of the nitrogen is from urine, 50% from manure, and then the manure piles have different rates of breakdown. Okay, so, oops. Okay, so once the manure is in this TAN pool, then there are different ways it can go. It can volatilize to the atmosphere. It's competed, so if it's washed out a lot, it won't volatilize as much. And so this shows the runoff from manure and runoff from fertilizer. One can see the runoff in these models, again, is concentrated, as one might expect, in regions of high application and in moist regions. Eastern US, Europe, China, and India, shown here. Fertilizer, manure, and that's this percent runoff. So again, it's these regions. China, Europe has quite a high percent, Eastern US, and this region and over Brazil, in both fertilizer and manure. So this is one of the things that we can use this model to do, is that in the future, as precipitation changes, presumably these patterns of manure loss due to runoff will also change in the future. Yeah.
So I'm assuming that, and considering all manure and fertilizer from surface, applied on the surface.
Yeah. So this is surface runoff. There will be additional runoff from leaching once the nitrogen from there goes into soils, it can be run off first. But this is sort of the.
Is that included in your?
No, it's not. Yeah. So in another work, again, this is preliminary results, is from Cindy Nevison et al. And what she's doing is looking at observed river export of nitrogen from rivers around the world. And we can also calculate this quantity in the model. I mean, the calculation is indirect. We need to know how the rivers run, how much of the nitrogen in the rivers is denitrified. But one can see it's a way of bounding. It's another way of constraining these type of parameterizations in Earth system models by looking at the runoff in rivers, which sure is pretty good data. Okay. Global fate of applied nitrogen. Fertilizer, the emissions are globally just under 25%. The runoff is a little bit higher, and most of it goes into the soil. For the manure, because the manure is applied slowly throughout the year, it's not applied as quickly. You see there's less ammonia emissions, less runoff, and more gets into the soil. Okay, if one looks at developing countries or developed countries, developing countries tend to occur where it's warmer, and you can see that in developing countries that the emissions, ammonia emissions, generally are higher than in these developed countries. This is global, US, Europe, India, China. So you can see Europe, there's quite a, in these calculations, there's quite a bit high ammonia emissions. So this may have to do partly with when we apply the fertilizer. Yeah. Yeah, this is largely temperature. So we assume the soil, so it does have a significance, but we assume so far it's 7. Okay, because stewards assured me that the pH of manure is about 7, and a lot of soils are buffered to be about pH of 7. But that is I mean, it is definitely affected by soil pH, that we haven't incorporated that. That's a good question. Yeah.
So the large amount going to soil organic matter here, is that implying that soil nitrogen is increasing by that much, or total soil organic matter is increasing?
Well, the losses implies most of the nitrogen put up. That implies that's where the end fate of the nitrogen from manure fertilizers, the soil organic matter. Okay? But it doesn't mean it's increasing, because so it can be lost from the soils either by leaching, by denitrification, by forest fires, by other means. Okay? So it's not it's not a yearly increase. It's just where is it going once it's in the manure?
So this is sort of leaving your model and going into the larger nitrogen cycling model?
That's right. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. This green here is essentially leaving our model, and then it can go into plants. It can be leached out. It can a number of other fates. Okay. Okay, and then one advantage of models is you can see what's happened over the last 150 years. And this is the case for global manure. This is the amount applied. This is the amount going into soils, runoff, and into emissions. And so you can see over time that the amount going into soil has decreased as the amount going into emissions and runoff has increased over the last percentage-wise over 150 years. For fertilizer, we get quite a big different picture. Fertilizers added all at once. And in the beginning, when very low amounts of fertilizer were added, these calculations suggest that only a little bit, most of it was incorporated into the soils, but as much larger quantities were added very quickly, that less could be incorporated into soils, and larger percentages were going into the air as ammonia, or into runoff. Sensitivities, we've looked at some of them. I think in the interest of time, I won't go over these. I want to briefly review future work. Obviously, agriculture management practices are important and can impact the emissions, fertilization dates, spreading practices, feed yards. And this is a view of Sutton et al., how one should do climate-dependent ammonia emissions. Some of them should be put onto the fields, as we did. Some of it should be applied as manure, where you might use a parameterization like ours. Some of it goes into unidirectional emissions due to feedlots, and these should probably be parameterized differently because this is in a controlled environment. They're not immediately sensitive to rainfall or the temperature outside, and these can be computed using emission factors. Okay, so there could be quite a bit of work adding this to adding more management practices and even future management practices into such a model to see how emissions might change as a function of climate. Obviously, once we get the emissions into the atmosphere, then we can see what the atmosphere does. And in the atmosphere, once we do that, there are many ways to evaluate the model, many more ways to evaluate it. Can evaluate against atmospheric measurements, against satellite data, against wet deposition, against aerosol data, etc. And we're eager to look at how emissions will change in the changing world as the amount of manure and fertilizer probably increases, as management practices change, and as the climate changes. Okay, so the conclusion, ammonia is poorly modeled in Earth system models, and I hope I made the case that there is importance in being able to incorporate it in these models to look at the impact of ammonia on climate, but also the importance is there's an importance of looking at the impact of climate on ammonia emissions. Emissions are expected to increase as the population grows. Implications for nitrogen cascade, for formation of aerosols, and there's implications which I didn't talk about for global pollution and health. Talked about climate-dependent global parameterization of the emissions, responsive to temperature precipitation. It has the ability to conserve nitrogen, carbon, and it suggests strong geographical and diurnal temperature dependence. So these I talked about, these are first steps, and it can obviously, there are many improvements possible. And then there are numerous applications to better understand the role of nitrogen as climate changes. So I thank you for your attention. I would, if any of you have feedback, I would very much appreciate it. As I said, I'm not a soil scientist, but I would very much appreciate any feedback from people who are in the field or know how this type of parameterization could be improved. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to run off to class in just a few minutes, but thanks for your attention.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.